Right below the hypothalamus, which is a region within our brain, we have the posterior pituitary gland and the anterior pituitary gland. Now, taking a closer look at the posterior pituitary gland, it is an extension from the hypothalamus. So it is more concentrated with these neurons that project from the hypothalamus, and the neurons themselves cannot produce hormones. So the hormones are actually going to be produced by the hypothalamus, and they are going to be stored and released in the posterior pituitary gland. Now, essentially, the hypothalamus, it also controls the posterior pituitary gland, and it will let this gland know when to release a certain hormone that it is storing. The posterior pituitary gland is responsible for storing and releasing two different types of hormones. First, we have our antidiuretic hormone, and we have oxytocin. So the antidiuretic hormone, or vasopressin, prevents urination. The word diuretic means to promote urination, so the opposite, being antidiuretic, will actually prevent urination. Now you may wonder, how do we prevent urination? Well, the antidiuretic hormone specifically targets the nephrons within our kidneys. Now, we know the nephrons to be this special structure that is responsible for either reabsorption or not absorbing specific salts like sodium chloride or water back into the bloodstream, depending on how concentrated we want that urine to be. Now, what this antidiuretic hormone does is that it inserts these aquaporins into the collecting duct at the end of the nephron. We actually see this collecting duct over here at the very end of the nephron, which is collecting what will potentially become urine and passed on to the bladder. Now, when these aquaporins are inserted into that collecting duct, we can see over here that these aquaporins will promote that water to move from the collecting duct into the bloodstream. Now, you may wonder, why do we want this water moving from the collecting duct into our bloodstream? Well, let's say, for example, on a day where we are not drinking enough water and our body becomes extremely dehydrated, the blood needs an alternative source to gain water. And in order to gain water, what it does is that it sucks out all the water that it needs from that collecting duct. So when this happens, you may notice that when you go to urinate, our urine is a lot more concentrated or a lot more yellow. And that's because we aren't drinking enough water, and the aquaporins are sucking out all that water at the collecting duct because our blood needs that water. So to once again summarize, the antidiuretic hormone, it's going to prevent urination, or it's going to cause more concentrated urine because that extra water is needed by our blood. So at the collecting duct, the aquaporins will suck that water out and give it to our blood. Now, the second hormone that is released by the posterior pituitary is oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is most commonly released in times of physical touch, but specifically, we're also going to talk about oxytocin release in times of uterine contractions and milk productions by the mammary glands. So, when oxytocin is produced, oxytocin utilizes a positive feedback loop, and a positive feedback loop is essentially amplifying whatever we are trying to cause. So for example, during labor, we have these uterine contractions, and over time, these contractions get stronger and stronger. That's because when oxytocin is being produced, it's on a feedback loop, and it's going to amplify whatever reaction it's trying to produce. So most commonly, we see oxytocin in not only our uterine contractions, but after the child labor, it's responsible for producing the milk through the mammary glands. So once again, we had, remember, the vasopressin or the antidiuretic hormone, and we had oxytocin, which are produced by the hypothalamus, but they are stored in the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is controlled by the hypothalamus, so the hypothalamus will tell the posterior pituitary when to release these two hormones, but the posterior pituitary itself is not able to produce these hormones because it is essentially a bundle of neurons, and those neurons cannot produce hormones. They just release them when the hypothalamus tells them to do so.